This is a University of California at Santa Barbara production.
Tonight, it's my great pleasure and a real honor to introduce our speaker, Sandra Mackey, who's a veteran journalist, an award-winning author, and also a commentator on CNN, who will be discussing her new book, The Reckoning, Iraq and the Legacy of Saddam Hussein, which was published by Norton in 2002. She's also the author of The Saudis, Inside the Desert Kingdom, Lebanon, Death of a Nation, which was named New York Times List of Notable Books, Passion and Politics, The Turbulent World of the Arabs, and also The Iranians, Persia, Islam, and the Soul of a Nation. She's a frequent guest on CNN, and she's also appeared as a commentator on Middle East events for Nightline, ABC Evening News with Peter Jennings, BBC, CBC, National Public Radio, and on and on. She's also been widely published as a journalist, and you may have seen her op-ed in the Los Angeles Times about a month ago. At a time when her expertise on the Middle East, particularly Iraq, is in such great demand, we particularly appreciate her accepting this invitation to speak tonight. And please join me in welcoming Sandra Mackey.
Thank you, Dr. Wallach. It is a real pleasure to be here, and I mean, who can say no to Santa Barbara? Actually, what I would like to do is make some relatively short comments, and then I'm going to just come down on the floor and to answer your questions or get some discussion going, because I think the topic tonight is one that everyone is most interested in, and I think we are all, it's a topic that we are all going to be personally engaged in. So I do want us to have some time for conversation. Let me begin by saying that unless the regime of Saddam Hussein quickly unravels, the United States in all likelihood will be at war in Iraq by January or February, even if we have to go alone. Saddam Hussein's regime is so repugnant and so focused on the preservation of the Iraqi dictator's personal power by any means that the Bush administration's call for a regime change, even at the cost of U.S. ground troops, is very seductive. Less seductive is the reality that the United States faces two problems in Iraq. The first is Saddam Hussein. The second is Iraq itself. Eliminating Saddam Hussein solves one problem while increasing the difficulty of dealing with the other, the Iraqi state. Well, why is Iraq the state so challenging? Well, Iraq is actually a contrived country that dates back to only 1921. It was carved out of the former Ottoman Empire after World War I for the sole purpose of meeting the imperial needs of Britain. The population is composed of a host of ethnic and religious groups that range from Arab Muslims to Assyrian Christians to an offshoot of the Kurds, popularly known as devil worshippers. None of these groups has ever shared the touchstones of identity that underlie authentic nations. Now, the three largest groups in Iraq, who make up probably 95% of the population, are first the Arab Sunnis. This means that these are Arabic-speaking people who follow the mainstream sect of Islam. They may be less than 20% of the population. They occupy central Iraq, known as the Sunni Triangle. And the reason it's called that is this is an area that is anchored in Baghdad, and it fans out then toward the borders of Syria and Jordan. The Iraqi Sunnis tend to identify themselves with the larger Arab world that lies west and south of its borders. And dating back to Ottoman times, the Sunnis have always held the economic and political power in Iraq, even though they have always been a minority in the country. Now, Saddam Hussein is a Sunni Arab, and this is the group that provides him his military strength and the group that kept him in power after the 1991 Gulf War. Now, the second group I want to talk about are the Kurds. They make up roughly another 20% of the population, and they generally occupy the northern arc of Iraq. They are non-Arabs, ethnically and culturally. They are Muslim by faith, but their real religion, I guess you would say, is this fierce sense of Kurdish nationalism and this desire that they have to have at the least an autonomous region, but more preferably an independent state, which they would call Kurdistan. Because of this sense of separate identity and of separate nationalism of the Kurds, they have always strained against Baghdad. Their demands for, as I say, autonomy at the least and independence as their ultimate goal is really complicated by the fact that they sit on top of much of Iraq's oil resources. So anytime you start talking about the Kurds separating themselves from Baghdad, then you get into all of these economic issues also. Now, the third major group in Iraq is composed of the Arab Shia. And again, this would be Arabic-speaking people, but this group of Arabs follow the dissenting sect of Islam known as Shiism. They make up 60% of the population and live in southern Iraq and Baghdad. Their attitudes are largely rural, and their social organization is tribal. Interestingly, the fact that the Shia have always been the majority of the population of Iraq has made no difference as far as the political and economic power structures have been concerned. In fact, the Shia have been an oppressed majority in a Sunni-controlled state. Now, a very important thing that I think you need to understand about the Shia is that they differ very greatly from the Sunnis about how they see Iraq's place in the world. While the Sunnis see Iraq as part of the larger Arab world, partly because that gives the Sunnis a certain weight in the power structure in Iraq, considering they are 20% of the population. The Shia react differently. They do not want to see Iraq part of the larger Arab world. They want to see it as a unique country in which the Shia, by force of numbers, would be the political and the economic elite. Now, each of these ethnic or sectarian groups is in turn subdivided into families and tribes who have always competed with each other within their own political group. And although class identities can on occasion bridge ethnic and sectarian boundaries, these tend to be simply temporary alliances aimed at gaining advantage against the dominant political power of the moment. Because the Iraqis have never found a common identity or have recognized common interest, the great challenge of Iraq has always been to turn a state into a nation in which a majority of Iraqis are willing to invest their interests and loyalties. Well, what is the political history of this country? Well, Britain ruled Iraq as a mandate under the League of Nations from 1921 to 1932, and they did it through a monarchy. And actually, this was again, like the country, a created monarchy, which was headed by Faisal, who was the son of the Sharif of Mecca. Now, to put you in touch with who Faisal really was, he's the Alec Guinness character in Lawrence of Arabia, the very distinguished man in the white robes. And Faisal was essentially plucked out of this post-war situation in which the Arabs thought they were going to have a state that covered the Middle East from the Tigris to the Nile. That didn't work because the British and the French decided to divide the Middle East among themselves, and Faisal wound up as an unemployed monarch. So the British decided, okay, let's bring him to Baghdad, and they hastily constructed a throne that they had. Iraq has very little wood, and so they found a beer crate on the banks of the Tigris River, put it together, and put Faisal on it. Actually, Faisal turned out to be a very good choice, and he was a very conscientious king. Principally, he worked just tirelessly to tie the tribes to Baghdad, and he struggled to develop a sense of nationalism among all groups. It wasn't easy. In fact, Iraq proved to be such a tough place to rule that the British decided to give the mandate its independence in 1932 and leave the problem to Faisal. And shortly before his death in 1933, Faisal lamented, quote, "There is still, and I say this with a heart full of sorrow, no Iraqi people, but an unimaginable mass of human beings devoid of any patriotic ideas, imbued with religious traditions and absurdities, connected by no common tie, giving ear to evil and prone to anarchy." Well, Faisal's successors proved far less able rulers than he. For the rest of the monarchy, the leadership defined Iraq in terms of Arab nationalism, to which neither the Kurds nor the Shia ascribed. Then in 1958, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup, and that ushered in 10 years of chaos under a succession of military governments. The first of these governments was headed by General Qasem, who actually tried to define Iraq as a unique country that stood apart from the Arab world. And it is too bad that Qasem really wasn't a more competent ruler. And I think it's also, a shame for the history of Iraq that Qasem wound up being assassinated, and not just that he was assassinated in the ordinary sense. It was done in the television studios of Baghdad, of the Baghdad network, and after he was dead, his head was held up before the cameras to let everyone know that he was in fact gone, which gives you a clue about how Iraqi politics is really played. It has been, throughout the history of the state, a situation in which leaders come and go, usually by very violent means. Well, Qassem's successors gave up this idea that Iraq was a unique country of Kurds, Sunnis, and Shia, and went back to identifying Iraq simply as part, in terms of Arab nationalism. In 1968, a political party called the Ba'ath took over Iraq, and this is, of course, the party of Saddam Hussein. Now, the Ba'ath Party, from the very beginning, did impose a rather oppressive rule. But at the same time, the party did attempt to overcome communalism. And in fact, they used the oil revenues of the 1973 oil boom to, quote, lift all boats. In other words, money was put into infrastructure, it was put into education, housing, health care, and in a sense, this was more or less the golden age of modern-day Iraq. You had the creation of a significant middle class. You had Iraq really seeming to be at the forefront of perhaps modernization and accommodation with the political system that really might lead the way for other Arab countries. But unfortunately, it all turned out, of course, to be just the opposite. But during this period of the Ba'ath's, what we might call golden age, someone, and it's suspected that it was Saddam Hussein, came up with the idea of defining Iraq as the modern rendition of ancient Mesopotamia, that this was going to be the identity that could be shared by Sunnis and Shia and Kurds. Well, historically, the idea was ridiculous. With the exception of the Christian Chaldeans and some Marsh Arabs, few Iraqis are even remotely descended from the Mesopotamians. Nevertheless, Babylon, Nineveh, Nimrud, Ur were celebrated and restored at the cost of millions of dollars. Yet at the same time, the Ba'ath was forced to put down a rebellion of the Kurds that lasted from 1970 to 1975. Now, the next challenge to the rule of the Ba'ath Party came actually from the Shia. Although it really didn't come from the Shia, it came from the paranoia of Saddam Hussein, who in 1979 became the sole power in Iraq. If you will remember, the Iranian Revolution occurred in 1979 also. It occurred in January. Saddam Hussein took over total power in July of 1979. What was going on at this time was that Ayatollah Khomeini was really beginning to push for an Islamic state that would actually go beyond. In other words, he was saying what we need to do is to get rid of all secular governments and that all of the Muslim countries come together as, one united area, somewhat like the idea of the Islamic Empire back in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries. Well, Saddam Hussein was, of course, the first secular leader that Khomeini would like to have seen go, and principally because Saddam Hussein ruled over a Shia majority. Well, Saddam Hussein became so concerned that Khomeini really was going to be able to pull the the Iraqi Shia out of his country, that he turned on Iran and invaded the country in September of 1980. And this turned out to be an absolutely useless war in which, between the two sides, you had something in the neighborhood of 1 million casualties. The war lasted 8 years, and at the end of it, in 1988, the Shia, who had fought really in the trenches for most of this war, proved that they were not going to pull out of Iraq and attach themselves to Shia Iran, that they really considered themselves to be first Arabs and secondly Shia. And so you had a moment in Iraqi history when it appeared that maybe you could finally begin to bridge this gap between these two sectarian groups. But of course, this left the Kurds out because the Kurds did not identify with the Arabs. And this is exactly why the Kurds were gassed in this terrible chemical weapons attacks in 1987, was because they were again rebelling against Baghdad, assuming that they could, you know, in the weakened condition Iraq was in at the end of this war, that they could pull out to have their own autonomous region. Well, in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and his humiliating defeat in the Gulf War seemed to spell the end of his regime. I say that because there were simultaneous rebellions of the Shia in the south and the Kurds in the north. And, you know, you assume they're going to topple Saddam Hussein. But they failed because the Sunnis of the army and those of central Iraq chose to stand with Saddam Hussein rather than see either of their ethnic or sectarian rivals triumph. So in the aftermath of the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein shelved all attempts to create a common identity for all Iraqis. Instead, he kept himself in power by reviving the tribalism that has plagued Iraq in varying degrees since the founding of the state. Now, the Alpha tribe is Saddam Hussein's family. Below that are the Sunni tribes around Tikrit. Tikrit is about 60 miles north of Baghdad, and it is the ancestral home of Saddam Hussein. Now, the Sunnis around Tikrit provide the manpower for Hussein's elite military units and his security services. Then moving down another level, there is an elaborate network of alliances between Saddam Hussein and various tribal leaders. These tribal leaders are Sunni, they're Shia, they're Kurd. They are traditional tribes and they're created tribes that substitute for labor unions, trade associations, professional organizations, etc. In this system, Saddam Hussein dispenses weapons, monies, and favors, and these tribal leaders police their tribes for Saddam Hussein. The result is that today Iraq is more a tribal society than it was when the state was created. And at the same time, the repressive nature of Saddam Hussein's 20-plus year rule has essentially destroyed civil society in Iraq. Consequently, the Iraqis are a fragmented and brutalized people incapable of governing themselves, at least in the short run. Well, what does all of this mean to current American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iraq? A lot. It poses the basic question, is the greater risk to the stability of the Persian Gulf Saddam Hussein with his weapons of mass destruction, or is it Iraq with all of its internal conflicts? There is no clear or easy answers, only difficult choices, each of which carries enormous risks for the United States. Let's look first at the risk of Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. And I'm really just going to sort of mention these because I think we have all heard these points argued a great deal. The first is, of course, what is the great danger that might occur if the United States waits and Saddam Hussein actually does obtain a nuclear capability? We have also heard the speculation that Saddam Hussein might well employ terrorism against the United States. These are very valid points. They are very, they're very realistic, and they are certainly issues that we must think about and think about very seriously. But what we have not heard much about is the risks for the United States if we unilaterally invade Iraq for the purpose of making a regime change. This will not be another Afghanistan where air power and indigenous forces ensure a rather painless U.S. victory. To begin with, we cannot blanket bomb Iraq without inflicting massive civilian casualties. And the Iraqi people are highly unlikely to welcome an American invasion. To begin with, they hold us responsible for 11 years of sanctions that have extracted a terrible price from most Iraqis. In short, the Iraqis, because they have only heard what Saddam Hussein has told them about the sanctions, have come to hate us more than they hate Saddam Hussein. And unlike Afghanistan, there is no indigenous force on the ground to take control once Saddam Hussein is toppled. The Iraqi National Congress, an umbrella organization of Iraqi opposition groups outside Iraq, constantly tries to sell the idea that it can overthrow Saddam Hussein and establish a post-Saddam government. The Bush administration seems to have embraced this idea. In fact, on October 20th of this year, the President released $92 million to train 5,000 members of the INC to accompany U.S. troops into Iraq, which would then mean that the INC would be put in place as an interim government for Iraq. Well, it won't work. To begin with, the members of the INC are predominantly Shia, and the Sunni military, which must be taken out before you get to Saddam Hussein, will actually fight to the last man to keep the Shia from taking control of Iraq. And even if the INC were put in place by the military power of the United States, it could not govern the country. The Iraqis see the INC as outsiders who have not suffered war and sanctions like the insiders. And secondly, the Iraqis won't accept a government which they see as a surrogate for the United States. Another reason that you would have a great deal of trouble putting the INC in as a government and actually having them succeed in holding Iraq together and actually being able to administer the country is that the members of the INC have no common ideology except their hatred of Saddam Hussein. They are Marxists to the heir apparent to the non-existent throne of Iraq, to Islamicists who want Iraq to become an Islamic republic. In reality, the INC replicates all of the divisions of Iraq itself. Finally, a group that cannot even agree on the content for its website cannot govern a country as difficult as Iraq. Well, with no government that can claim legitimacy among a majority of Iraqis, there is a very real danger that Iraq will become a bloodbath in the early post-Saddam period. It is almost a given that communal group will seek revenge on communal group and tribe will avenge itself against tribe for all the grievances of the past. Iraq could well fragment into parts, threatening chaos in the whole region. With stability in the Persian Gulf essential to U.S. vital interest, it is at this point that the United States would have to commit itself to policing Iraq. And that threatens to bog us down in a conflict between communal groups from which there is no quick exit. We are looking at an American presence in Iraq for years, not months. Before we move on to questions, I would like to close with an excerpt from my book. If the United States, by circumstance or choice, does invade Iraq, policymakers have to understand the real Iraq, not an Iraq built on some exaggerated expectation that the removal of the despot of Baghdad will solve all of Iraq's problems and all the challenges to the United States in the Persian Gulf. And every American has to understand what the United States is walking into and what the unanticipated results of that intervention might be. Already engaged in a war against terrorism in another tribal society, the United States cannot wade unaware into Iraq as it once waded into Vietnam. Granted, Iraq is not Vietnam. From one perspective, the geopolitical stakes in the Persian Gulf are indisputable. From another perspective, there is among the Iraqis no nationalism powerful enough to inspire civilians to fight for years in the cause of their nation. Nevertheless, the ghosts of Vietnam hover around Iraq. They are there because the United States is again in danger of stumbling into the internal conflicts of another people, only to become trapped in old feuds it never comprehended. In this new era of the American experience that began on September 11, 2001, the United States can no longer afford to be seduced by its own military power or by a naive faith that foreign worlds always can be simplified and mastered.
Sandra would be delighted to receive questions and to respond. She would urge that everyone use the mics to each side of the stage, and if you could, actually stand up here so that, we can keep you on film. All right, so by all means make use of the mics, and she's anxious to receive your questions.
Okay, can you hear on, this mic.
Thank you for a good presentation also. My question was, can you explain the American efforts to contribute to the validity behind the American contributions to Saddam's army during the 1980 war that you were talking about against Iran?
Yes. Well, this is what mistaken foreign policy can cause. Actually, let's go back to 1979 and the taking of the hostages in Iran. It was a really emotional thing that happened to the United States. I mean, I think that next to, at that time, it was somewhat the equivalent of September 11th in the fact that the emotions it aroused in the American public. And it wasn't that it was an attack on our, inside our borders, but it was an attack on American public servants. They were generally foreign service people and who were serving in Tehran. And there really was, an obsession with Iran during that time. And what has been the problem with U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Iraq all along has been that we've never really dealt with Iraq as Iraq itself. We've always dealt with it as part of the larger puzzle of the Persian Gulf. In other words, we saw Iraq for a long time as being possibly a surrogate of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union might finally get into the Persian Gulf by way of Iraq. And so that was one reason that we began to really build up the Shah in Iran. It was to balance Iraq. Well, during the 80s, when then Iran was perceived as the big threat to the United States, then we began to build up Saddam Hussein in Iraq without, again, thinking beyond what the immediate military advantage of that might be. And I might mention that some of the most hawkish people in the administration were the ones who had the idea to arm Saddam Hussein back in the 80s. And when I say arm, That's not exactly right. We actually made it possible for him to acquire various war material. We didn't actually give them to them or sell them to them directly. I didn't want to make that point. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Are you aware of any plan, possibly deep within the Bush administration that hasn't been made public yet, of some grandiose scheme to correct the British error in creating Iraq in the first place and to divide it into, let's say, Kurdistan, Sunnistan, and Shiistan?
No. I think that we will not do that. And let me tell you why. The territorial integrity of Iraq is very important to the stability of the region. And that's what we're really concerned about, because obviously the Persian Gulf is really in the core of U.S. vital interests. And the reason that we don't want the country to split up is that you just don't know what the consequences would be of that. And I think the first one you look at is what is going to happen with the Kurds. Are they going to become independent? And therefore, are they going to pull Kurds out of Iran and Turkey and Syria, thereby destabilizing those countries? The country that is just obsessed with this is Turkey. And Turkey has even gone so far as to say if the Kurds do establish an independent state in northern Iraq, that Turkey will invade and prevent that from happening. And Turkey's price, if they agree to allow the United States to use Turkish territories in a war against Iraq, is that the state will be held together. The question is what happens to the Sunni part of the country, because most of the oil wealth is either to the north or to the south. So, where would the Sunnis go? How would they support themselves? Is Syria going to come in and take them, etc.? Then the third big concern is, it's been talked about a lot that if the Shia in the south broke away from Baghdad, that they would then attach themselves to Iran. I think that's the least likely thing to happen. Remember, the Iranians are Persians, the Iraqi Shia are Arabs. There is no love lost between Persians and Arabs. And I don't think the Iraqis would choose to do that. I don't think the Iranians would choose to incorporate this number of Arabs into their population. But what is affecting the Shia situation is that the countries on the Arabian Peninsula that have Shia populations, principally Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, some of the other smaller countries, they have great fear of a Shia state in southern Iraq because they're afraid it's going to pull their people, again, it's going to destabilize their regimes. And so it is not necessarily the United States would just be totally opposed to this, although that's not their first choice, but it's that the people in the region really don't want this. Our allies in the region say, no way, we don't want this. Yes.
I wish you could talk a little more about oil in relation to the Saddam regime. And it's my understanding, but I may be wrong, that in the late 60s and 70s, Saddam took away control of oil from foreign oil companies, and by getting it under Iraqi control, was able to pay for the social services and education which you referred to in the early 70s. Didn't that give him a certain nationalist legitimacy which still goes on despite all of the sanctions and the problems? And isn't that what the United States and the British want to get rid of and come back in with foreign companies again?
You know, I don't have any insight into what the thinking is in the administration about the oil situation. Let me just give you some general comments. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the Persian Gulf, so obviously oil is going to be a huge factor in Iraq policy. You know, there are all sorts of various speculations that one of the reasons that the Saudis don't want to participate in a war against Iraq is that they don't want Iraq oil back on the market that would then, you know, impact on oil prices. The other side of that is that the Bush administration wants to invade Iraq to get control of the oil resources so we can keep oil prices down. But let me make this comment. So much of the debate about whether or not there is American military action against Iraq really depends on not whether we go into Iraq, but it is when and how we do it. And up until August, the administration was really heading straight toward the idea that that the United States was going to take unilateral action against Iraq, and anybody who wanted to come along with us was invited. And I mean, the British said they were going to participate, but that was about as far as it went. And then in August, the president was getting so much flack about this, not only from other countries. We weren't able to get anybody else on board in the region where we could even put the troops and the equipment to invade Iraq. I mean, we have only two commitments, Kuwait and Qatar, and believe me, they're not big enough to hold all these this material that we will need. And actually, the plan that was became public this weekend, that was leaked somehow from the Pentagon, that we're going to send 200 and 250,000 troops in, that we're going to invade, south from Basra, and then we are going to occupy Iraq. Actually, that was pretty well known in the intelligence community way back, last winter. That same plan was accepted as that was what we were going to do. And so what happened was that there was a real debate within the administration between Colin Powell in the State Department and Donald Rumsfeld and the Defense Department that had really been going on since the administration came in. And I like to call them, the doves and the hawks, because the doves were saying, if we invade Iraq, we've got to do it under an international coalition, as we did with the Gulf War. And we can't go in there alone because it's going to cause so much upheaval in the region. And the hawks were saying, we've got this opportunity that we are the sole superpower, we can win this war without any problem. We need to go and go now. And really did not want the United Nations involved because of the idea that that would then tie the United States' hands to do whatever it wanted to do. Well, Colin Powell had really been pretty much cut off at the knees, and then suddenly, out of the woods, comes Brent Scowcroft, Lawrence Eagleburger, Jim Baker, General Zinni, all of whom had been very closely allied with George Sr. in his administration. And of course, Brent Scowcroft was the National Security Advisor, and Jim Baker and Lawrence Eagleburger had both been Secretary of State, and Zinni had been in charge of the Persian Gulf Theater. And they said, you can't do this by yourself. You got to get the UN. So the president went to the United Nations, made the speech, and really set fire under the UN. Colin Powell did an enormous amount of lobbying, and last Friday the resolution was accepted. Now, the question we're facing right now is, you know, what are the there are mechanisms in this resolution that the United States claims would allow it to go ahead and invade Iraq, whether or not the other countries of the United Nations participated or not. Now, you know, how tough are we going to be on that? How rigid are we going to be? In other words, are we really wanting to do this as a multilateral operation, or is the Defense Department still determined that we're going to do this essentially unilaterally? And the reason I say that this is so important is because if we go in unilaterally, the perception is going to be, whatever the reality is, that the United States is not interested in, you know, liberating the Iraqi people. What we're wanting to do is to go in and occupy Iraq and to control the oil resources. And this is going to have real political ramifications for the United States across the Arab world, and I think beyond. Now, what the reality is, I have no more insight than you do, but obviously oil is playing a role in this.
Do you know, or do you have any sense of whether or not the invasion is inevitable, or is there some potential for a peaceful resolution to the situation we find ourselves in now?
Well, I think that's what we're really waiting for right now, is to see how this is going to play out. The first test is going to come Friday. And if Saddam Hussein says, no way am I going to allow the inspectors in, then I think it is reasonable that you start going through the UN mandate and so forth, and prepare to force him into compliance. Now, if he does let the inspectors in, they have a certain period of time in which they are to report and so forth. And I think the thing that we have to be aware of is to get those inspectors in is very, very important, whether they find all his weapons or not. To begin with, you have forced Saddam Hussein to bow to international pressure. That's good for the United Nations. I think it's good for the world. It also creates an environment in which Saddam Hussein, in the eyes of his own people, may look like he's weakened. And, you know, we tend to talk about Saddam Hussein's strengths, but we don't talk about his weaknesses. And his weakness is the fact that he really doesn't have absolute control of Iraq beyond the center of the country. And the farther you get out of Baghdad, you can just sense the lessening of the power of Saddam Hussein. I'll just give you an example of this. When you go to Iraq, you can't go any place unless you have your government-appointed babysitter with you, that is called your minder, and your government-provided car. And when I was going around places, you know, within the vicinity of Baghdad, I mean, this government car would drive up, and I mean, everybody would jump up and they would clear the way and wave you in, you know, and you would park in the best parking place and off you'd go. Very, very much a sense that the government car really meant something. Now, the farther south you went or the farther north you went, it was exactly the opposite, because a government car was a symbol of, you know, it was an opportunity of defiance. And I remember that at one point up around Mosul, that we'd be driving down the street and all these cars would just come over and they would just sort of crowd you to the side. Now, not to the point that anybody could get out and arrest these drivers, but it was obvious that they were making a statement against this government car. And so if you get those inspectors on the ground and they really have some muscle, then Saddam Hussein is going to appear weakened. And that's at the point when all of these tribal alliances, which his power is resting on now, really starts disintegrating. Because by the tribal code of conduct that is hundreds of years old in this region, is you attach yourself to someone you perceive as powerful. And once their power is in question, then you begin to seek other alliances. And so we conceivably could get rid of Saddam Hussein without having to invade. And let me say one other thing. We've got some time to let these inspections take place, because it's the nuclear weapon that we really have to be aware of. You know, I think we've got to live with the fact that you cannot get rid of all these chemical and biological weapons. They're too easy to make, they're too easy to hide. But it's the nuclear weapon, which is the strategic weapon, that you want to keep out of his hands, and that's what the inspectors can find. But they've got to have some time. They cannot do this by January or February.
I was wondering if we do invade and there's a possibility that Saddam Hussein's regime is toppled, then and the U.S. fails to install like a feasible government there, like the people reject it, is there a possibility? Is there any one group of people in Iraq that could possibly seize power? Is there any one group stronger, like possibly more unified than the others? And what kind of ramifications could that possibly have with Iraq's foreign relations with the other countries in the Middle East?
The one group that would have power to actually take control would be the military, which is dominated by the Sunnis. And the government that they would establish would be, in all probability, very similar to the governments you've had through the history of Iraq, where you have the Sunnis have economic and political priorities above the other people. One of the things that has been talked about in the conversation about a post-Saddam government, both by the INC and by the United States, is the establishment of democracy. Well, even that is a problem. I mean, you know, that seems like that would be easy. You know, we have a democracy and the Iraqis rule themselves and everything will be peachy keen. Well, the thing is that if you establish a democracy right away on a one-man, one-woman vote, who's in power? The Shia. They've got 60% of the population. The Sunnis are not going to accept it. The Kurds are not going to accept it. So the first challenge to a post-Saddam Iraq is to devise some kind of political system in which you do give the Shia their rights, but you give protection to the Sunnis and the Kurds. Now, it's going to take a genius to figure that out. But once it's figured out, then how do you sell it to the Iraqis and say, this is the government you need? Essentially, I think what we're looking at, and again, what is so important to any action we take against Iraq be done multilaterally, is that you're going to have a period where Iraq is going to need intensive care. It's really going to have to be wrapped in the blanket of civil society and rather nursed back to health. And we are not in a position that we can do that alone. Because, number one, if we do invade, then we're looked upon as simply an imperialist power. Secondly, as I said before, the Iraqis have such a, they have just been convinced so much that it's the United States' fault about the sanctions, which the reality is, if Saddam Hussein had cooperated with the weapons inspectors, those sanctions could have been lifted, 6 months after the Gulf War. But the Iraqi people don't know that. So they are not really going to be very anxious to cooperate with an American administration, and that's why, is the big danger of just getting stuck with this tar baby of Iraq, and we can go in there easily. It's getting out that's the problem.
I have two questions for you. One, why didn't President Bush, didn't take out Hussein, in your opinion, in the Gulf War? And number two, why is our government still insistent that there's a connection between September 11 and Iraq, when clearly our allies and even our CIA have said that there's no such thing? So I would like your comments.
All right, first, was it a big mistake not to go to Baghdad in '91? Actually, George Sr. made the decision for very valid reasons not to go. The first one was exactly what we're talking about. How do you get out of there? Because, we had a very clear and defined mission in the Kuwait operation. And that was, once the Iraqis are out of Kuwait, the mission is completed. So it was to avoid getting trapped into the communal conflicts of Iraq. Secondly was that it was a deal that the United States made with the Allies to get this coalition together, that the Arab countries were willing to come on board if the United States promised that they would not be a permanent military presence in the Persian Gulf. And so those two factors, and I think history's proved that those were good decisions. You also say that there was the optimism that no leader could survive the defeat that Saddam Hussein suffered. But Saddam Hussein survived exactly because he was able to play all of these divisions among the Iraqis against each other. Okay, the second question was?
The connection between...
Oh, September the 11th, yeah. Obviously, if Saddam Hussein could be tied into September 11th, there would be, the United States could do what it wanted by itself, and there would not be any opposition, or very little opposition, from the rest of the world. And that's the reason that the administration would love to tie Saddam Hussein into September 11th. I get real nervous when I talk about logic and Saddam Hussein, but having said that, let me proceed. Logically, Saddam Hussein really did not have any particular interest in being involved in September 11th. I say that because Hussein and Osama bin Laden, in essence, are rivals for the same constituency. What Saddam Hussein really wants, and remember, he's a very needy person in the ego department, he really wants to be hailed by the Arabs across the whole region as the new Saladin or the new Nasser, someone that all of the masses look up to as a great hero. Osama bin Laden wants to use these same people to destroy existing governments and establish an Islamic empire. And of course, the first secular government that could go would be Saddam Hussein. He would be one that would go. And so when you start looking at it this way, you see that the only thing that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden would have in common is hostility to the United States. So let's assume that Saddam Hussein funds September 11th. And it's this, spectacular event, and it, causes all this grief and damage to the United States. And so if Saddam Hussein then comes out and says, I did it, I'm responsible, what's going to happen? We're going to hit him with everything we've got. If he has to keep his mouth shut, who gets the credit? Bin Laden. So that simply builds Bin Laden up, diminishes Hussein. So, you know, having said that, another thing I think that Saddam Hussein is probably not involved with Al-Qaeda or perhaps some of the other international terrorist organizations is he's a control freak. And he can't stand to not be in control. And if he does provide chemical and biological weapons to these rather ad hoc terrorist groups, he's not in control. And so, I mean, definitely he has engaged in terrorism. It's been principally against his political enemies. And I think Saddam Hussein, you know, probably would love to launch a terrorist attack against the United States, but one that he was in control of, that one he directed.
Given that Saddam Hussein is a secular leader, and he was in fact threatened by the Islamic takeover of Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, I was hoping you could give some insight as to what his motivation was behind putting the words Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, on the Iraqi flag.
Oh, well, Saddam Hussein has found religion recently. And again, Mesopotamia didn't work as an identity for the Iraqis. And Saddam Hussein right now is toying with Islam as the unifying theme of the Iraqis. But again, you know, he's got to be careful because he certainly doesn't want to create an Islamic movement that might overthrow him. One of the things that has happened, particularly to the Shia community, is that the clerical establishment among the Shia has been just stripped. I mean, it's very interesting. You go to the shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala, and you could hardly find a cleric because they've all been deported on charges that they are really Iranians. And because, see, Shiism has a very structured hierarchy, and that was one reason that the Iranian Revolution succeeded, was because there was already an organization. It just had never become politicized before. It was in the Iranian Revolution. And so that's one thing that Saddam Hussein has wanted to prevent happening in Iraq among the Shia.
I was just wondering what you thought the consequences were going to be of a nation fighting a war on two fronts, one on terrorism, which is still very prevalent, second, the war in Iraq, in combination with a war that can potentially, I've heard, cost in the hundreds of billions of dollars in a nation that's economically depressed, relatively speaking, I guess.
Yeah, you know, there is grave concern in the uniformed military about spreading American forces too thin. In fact, that's what General Zinni has been talking about. Because, you know, you do have the Afghanistan operation going on. You certainly are going to have a lot of personnel available just to protect domestic sites in case of in case of war. And then, of course, you're going, you know, you don't know how many men this occupation will take, and you don't know how unstable that region is going to be. So there definitely is this problem of resources, both manpower and equipment. But I think that you know, one of the real risks, or I don't think it's even a risk, it's a known, that this war, just the military operation, not an occupation, is going to cost somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. And the Gulf War cost about $65 billion. But that was paid for almost entirely by the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Japanese, and the Germans. We were almost a mercenary army in that war. This time around, if we go in essentially alone, then we're going to carry the whole burden of that. Secondly, anytime you start having instability in the Persian Gulf, oil prices spike. Now, how long that will last, no one can say, because supplies are certainly better today than they were in 1990 when Hussein invaded Kuwait. But certainly in the short term, you're going to have increased oil prices. I think in the long run, what the United States really has to be aware of is that we now live in a global economy. And if we offend enough countries, they can actually get back at us in lots of little ways. Trade agreements, various sharing resources, things like that. And so that you can almost be bled to death by 1,000 pricks, So the economic risk of a unilateral invasion of Iraq are definitely there, and they're very serious.
Could you elaborate on the reasons behind Turkey's opposition to an independent Kurdistan?
Okay. Turkey has a significant Kurdish population that also happens to sit on what little oil Turkey has. But the Kurdish population of Turkey has been a real problem for Turkey over a number of years. It's actually probably better today than it has been, say, over the last decade. But Turkey is just really nervous that they're going to lose the southeastern part of their country, which is heavily Kurdish, that you would pull out if they had some place to go. So that's the reason. Yes.
I wonder if you believe that our invasion of Iraq will lead to great turmoil amongst the Arab nations, and what are some of the factors that might produce that? Would Hussein attack Israel and receive a counter retaliation? I don't know what else, but you keep hearing about the man in the street and the instability of the governments.
This is, again, the big unknown. What is going to happen to these other countries? Certainly, the three most fragile Arab countries that could really be affected by this would be Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. Egypt, I think, is the most likely to go. And the only organized opposition in Egypt is the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're talking about a militant Islam possibly there. Saudi Arabia and Jordan probably could keep control at least for a while just simply through their military power. But the big, one of the issues that has not been talked about very much, Milton Biorst, who's a very knowledgeable journalist on the Middle East, he's written for the New Yorker for many years, had a piece in the New York Times on September 11th saying that September 11th was an example of something happening that you never thought could happen, and that you always had to be aware of the worst possible scenario. And he was pointing out that Saddam Hussein, when he gets pushed in a corner and feels like he's going to lose power, is when he does crazy things. And I think it's probably a given that Saddam Hussein will attack Israel with something. And Israel has said it will retaliate. And they will retaliate with with full force. The Israelis have at least 100 nuclear warheads. And, you know, what if Israel would actually use some of those warheads? What's going to happen to the region? And that's why I say these are all things you have to think about, that this is not necessary. I mean, there are people I hear who are knowledgeable people who say, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. You know, we'll be in there and out in a week and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Well, I just think there are just too many unknowns. And, you know, as I say, ultimately, the United States may come around to the decision that if Saddam Hussein really has a nuclear potential on the table, you know, we may have no other choice. But we just need to really keep in mind at this point what all of the negatives are to this. Yes?
I was just going to ask, actually, do you think that Saddam Hussein actually has nuclear capabilities to threaten America? And if so, are they greater than the capabilities that North Korea has right now?
I am not a military person, so I am going to have to tell you what the people at the Sam Nunn School at Georgia Tech in Atlanta told me. No one thinks Saddam Hussein has a nuclear weapon at this point. I mean, not even George Bush. You can't deny that he wants one, and he wants one very badly. You get into a discussion then, what does he want it for? And some people will say, well, he wants it to attack the United States. Well, he doesn't have the delivery capability, but you know, he might be able to get a dirty bomb in someplace or something. What Saddam Hussein probably wants it for is just so he could have it and he can be the big deal, you know. Because if Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein would be, you know, a tyrant of a third world country, you know, because he has reduced Iraq to that position. These chemicals of mass, these weapons of mass destruction, you know, give him at least the illusion and certain reality that he is really a powerful figure. And that's what motivates him. He's so far, Iraq is so far behind North Korea, there's no comparison whatsoever. Yeah. Okay.
I'd like to hear you address a question about human rights and Saddam's record of human rights and what the UN inspector had to say about his violations being the worst since World War II, and relate that with the question about ousting him from power.
Related to what?
To ousting him from power, from war with Iraq, from our invasion, or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean...
Do you understand my last part of that?
Not exactly.
Well, with nuclear weapons aside, and his threat on the U.S. for that reason, considering attack on his regime merely for the human rights violation itself. Okay, that's my question.
Okay. In other words, is there a moral imperative there that from the human rights position?
Well, the things I've been reading about the human rights violations have been huge in themselves, and not doing something seems to be somewhat like condoning it, but or turning your eye. I'd just like to hear your opinion on that.
Oh, well, I mean, there is no doubt Saddam Hussein is a horrible person. In fact, I would say, one thing about talking about attacking Iraq, you know, to get Saddam Hussein, this is real saleable because, you know, it's like central casting sent the ultimate villain, and you know, you need to attack him. And I don't think anybody would argue that the world would be a better place without Saddam Hussein. And certainly we have to be really concerned about the Iraqi people, ultimately what's going to happen to them. And that's, I think that's one of the dilemmas about this whole thing is, you know, you really see a positive in getting rid of Saddam Hussein. And that's why I keep repeating, it's not whether you go into Iraq, it's when and how you do it. And I think it's the international community that needs to make the statement about this. But it's very difficult for the United States to say we're going to go to war against Iraq because Saddam Hussein's human rights violations when the United States refused to participate in the International Criminal Court. I mean, you know, the administration is sending two messages, and that's one of the problems. And one of the problems of talking about invading Iraq is that one, you know, for so long it was regime change, and now it's to control his weapons. And you need to define what you're going to do. And that's why I say that George Sr. did such a good job at the time of the Gulf War in saying, this is the cause, this is the objective, and this is what we're going to do. We're very muddled. And regardless of what happens, the United States has got to get on message. You know, why are we doing this? You know, what are we going to do? And why are we doing it? And why are we doing it this way? And why are we doing it now?
In light of the fact that that there needs to be international agreement about whatever sanctions are taken. Can you comment on the capitulation almost of the people in the UN the nations that were resisting this resolution, because they stood, it seemed to me, for that stand like, wait, we'll slow it down, and it's not until we have international accord, and then we'll move forward. And this kind of capitulation seems it's being touted as, if not a mandate, at least some sort of acquiescence to unilateral American.
Well, I think the President made a very good point in saying, you know, if the United Nations doesn't do something, the United Nations is going to become irrelevant. And I think that was valid. I don't exactly, you know, and I don't know what went on behind the scenes. You know, I mean, for one thing, I think it's very interesting that Syria voted with this. I'm sure there's a lot of economic aid behind that. I think, you know, maybe a changed relationship with the United States. I think it's interesting that the French, the French finally went along. I think it's probably a given that the Russians were promised that their economic interests in Iraq would be protected in case of an invasion, however, whether it's unilateral or multilateral. Those things will probably eventually come out, but it was an enormous effort at diplomacy that worked. And as I say, I just think that it would be too bad if the United States jumped the gun and let all that work go when we don't have to do it right now. So, yeah. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Sandra Mackey for a superb presentation.
Thank you.
We'll have